In the last video, I drew you a picture. This time, I'm going to tell you a little story. Someone comes across a really steep sidewalk curb, like way too tall, over a foot tall. The person says, "This curb is too steep." And somebody else comes along and says, "You're right, dude. The curb is way too steep. Someone needs to do something about that." Then 4 or 5 other people come along and they also say, "That curb is too tall." Finally, you stroll by and notice the commotion. You ask the first person, "You're right, but what do we do about it?" The first person responds, "Well, we should just get rid of the curb, have a flat, even sidewalk so that no one trips over it." The second person juts in and says, "No, we should have the curb slanted like a ramp." How do you respond? You say, "I think you're both right, but we can't get rid of the whole curb, otherwise cars are going to be driving along the sidewalk, and we can't make it all a ramp for a similar reason, so instead I think we should have a ramp every 6 feet or so." Here we have an example of someone filling a gap. They looked at the research, so to speak, the group of people noticing the sidewalk, and they looked at the different ideas that those people had in response to that problem, and they proposed their own idea. You notice that where the other people were lacking or ignoring a potential solution, you came up with your own. But how do we communicate this new debatable idea? That's why in essay writing we talk about thesis statements. A thesis statement is a 1 or 2 sentence statement that's designed to tell us what the essay is about overall. And it's not just essays that have thesis statements, by the way. The video you're watching right now has some sort of main idea I'm trying to express. In fact, every video in this series has had a thesis statement, as well as the whole series overall. Why do we need thesis statements? Well, for one reason, you need to let your audience know about why we should care about what you've written or what you're saying. What are you adding to the overall conversation, and why does it matter? A good thesis statement includes the following, these 2 main things. The first one is a central main point, an argument, an opinion, a stance. What are you trying to say? The second key piece is reasoning, some kind of answer to the question, so what? Why should we care? While it's important for your audience to know what you're talking about, it's just as important for you to know. If you're unable to distill your main idea into 1 sentence or 2, you're going to be lost. All these ideas about thesis statements and arguments relate back to something called rhetoric. What is rhetoric? You've probably heard this term before, but you might not know what it means. You may have heard rhetoric used in a negative political context, for example, Donald Trump's hateful rhetoric or the rhetoric of the left. Simply put, rhetoric is the means and methods of persuasion, or the ways in which we convince people of something, whether that's through speech or writing. With this definition in mind, we'll want to get rid of the idea that rhetoric is good or bad. Rhetoric is a tool. It depends on how you use it. For example, a hammer can be used to hurt somebody, but it can also be used to build something. Primarily, we use rhetoric through rhetorical appeals. The 3 most common appeals are ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is appealing to credibility. For example, in part 1 of this series, I established my own credibility by telling you that I'm an English instructor. That appeals to your sense of credibility because you're more likely to trust an English instructor on these concepts than some random guy. Logos is appealing to logic, and we do this primarily through things like data, statistics, and quantifiable measurements, but we also appeal to logic through cause and effect. If you touch the hot stove, you will burn your hand. That's logic. Pathos is appealing to your audience's emotion, and we do this a lot through humor, personal examples, distressing images, sad stories, etc. But why are we talking about rhetoric? Being able to identify and think about rhetoric allows us not only to examine the ways that we are being influenced, it also gives us the ability to use these tools to our own advantage in the writing and communicating that we do. Because you are a unique, valuable individual, you have a ton of ideas to express. And the reason we must find our voice is that we can use our voice. And we use our voice through rhetoric, through persuasion. We practice all the critical thinking skills we've already discussed in previous videos, and we apply those skills by generating our own unique ideas. Here's a question I like to debate with my students a lot. What is more important, having knowledge or generating new ideas? The answers I get are usually all over the place, but most students tend to lean toward having knowledge as being more important. They argue that without knowledge, we would not be able to generate new ideas at all. Knowledge gives us a lot of power, authority, and ability in our day-to-day lives. I agree with all these points, but I always advocate that generating new ideas is more important. It doesn't mean that knowledge isn't important or not necessary, it definitely is, but if all we did was know stuff, society and culture would not progress at all. Every day we are faced with seemingly impossible challenges: political division, climate change, injustice, tyrannical governments, etc. Anyone can point out, learn about, and then complain about those problems, but it's an entirely different and, I would argue, more valuable tool to be able to present and communicate solutions to those problems. I also think this is more powerful and practical in our day-to-day lives. For example, if you want to be a nurse, nurses who can adapt quickly to unexpected situations are valued more than a nurse who only relies on knowledge. Yes, to be a nurse, you have to know and understand and remember a lot about human biology, but if you can't apply those things to uncertain scenarios, you won't be effective. You can say the same thing about engineers, salespeople, receptionists, and yes, even teachers like me. Here are some questions to ponder. I'll actually repeat this one again. What do you think is more important, having knowledge or generating new ideas? Think about a time you used rhetorical appeals, whether that's ethos or logos or pathos, and probably all three. What did you persuade the other person to think or do? Is there an issue of particular cultural, political, or social importance to you? What about that issue is important? What do you want to find out about it? In the next part, we'll wrap up and conclude this series by answering a big question. So what? Why did we spend all this time talking about our voice? If we find our voice and learn how to use it, why does that matter? What's so important about writing and communication? See you next time.